I always have this effect on the room. When I walk forward, everybody just, there's a hush that follows all over the room. It's really great. I'm Cindy O'Donnell Allen. I know a lot of you in the room, but not every single person in here. I want to thank you for coming. This is the first of a series of talks that we're going to be offering this semester called Civics, Contemporary Literacies of Civic Life. Yes. Is that right? Yes. We actually had this series last year, and it was sponsored by the College of Liberal Arts with a generous fund from the dean and supported by the CSU English department. This year, CSU Writing Project has taken over the funding piece of it, and we, of course, still enjoy the support of the English department. Pam Koch is one of our Ontario's and my partners in crime, and so we're happy that both of them are here too. Ontario's going to tell you just a little bit about hashtags, so I'm going to let you do that, and then I'll introduce our two ladies who are here today.
Hi everybody. So we're going to be tweeting throughout this series, or tonight's event, and the rest of the series. So for those of you who are on Twitter, particularly the students who are required to tweet for my class, I encourage you to use the hashtag CSULit15, which is a little unwieldy, but it's easy to remember. CSULit15 throughout the evening. Both Nicole and Danielle have given me resources, so we'll be sharing those there, as well as this will be a good place for them to check up and follow up on questions and stuff you'll have. CSULit15 on the Twitter. This is also for people who are watching online. People who are watching virtually through that box.
That sounds like an old man on the Twitter.
On the Twitter. Get off my lawn.
This is the first talk, as I said, and we have others coming up. You can go to cswritingproject.net. CSU Writing Project is all one word, to get some information about the other talks. But just briefly, I'll say the next one is in February 17th. Ben Kirshner, who's a faculty director of CU Engage, which does work with youth civic literacy, he'll be coming to join us. March 31st, we'll have a CSU alum here named Bud Hunt. He's an instructional technologist at St. Vrain Valley School District. He's fantastic. Dr. Elise Eidman-Adol will be here April 7th. She's the executive director of the National Writing Project. And then our last group will be a panel of teachers and Colorado students who are involved in civic questions, particularly around some of the work in Jefferson County, or the controversy in Jefferson County that you may have heard of regarding the AP history curriculum, and students were very involved in pushing back against the changes that the school board wanted to make and made their voices heard. So we're going to have a panel of those folks come for the very last one. It's going to be a really exciting series, and we're thrilled that Nicole and Danielle are here to get things started tonight. I have this official list of things to read to you that they do, but I'm going to say right now, they don't know what's coming to you. So you're like a little nervous right now?
No, I can do this immensely. Okay.
We're friends, as you can see. But the interesting thing about working in a professional community, and by community I mean just really loosely with other literacy researchers and educators nationwide, is that you often get to know one another through your work first. And then you start putting a face with that work, and occasionally, in an surprising move, people turn out to be really nice and wonderful. Because sometimes they aren't, you know, sometimes they're all stuffy and awful, but not these two, they're great. I met Danielle very informally at a National Writing Project resource development retreat when we were working on some things together. But I really met her with my students through a resource that she published on this Digital Is, which is a National Writing Project online kind of series of resources that are really wonderful. And we did a hangout with my class, and so we met in that way. And then the following summer, I think, Taro got the three of us together, and we worked on a book together, and have been fast friends ever since. But I've learned so much from these ladies, and I just want to tell you a little bit about their wonderful credentials. Danielle is a doctoral student at Teachers College in English education. She was a high school teacher for almost a decade in Detroit, and she was also a school board member, which I didn't know, but has really been involved in advocacy work overall with youth and with teachers. She's in the Wayne State Writing Project, co-founder of the Detroit Progressive Educator Coalition and member of the Detroit Future Schools Program, which is an initiative to design and implement digital media arts integrated curriculum. Very interested in the intersections that she's going to talk about tonight among critical pedagogy, youth digital production, and civic engagement in urban class settings. Nicole is also an urban educator who taught in New York and Los Angeles, right? I don't know how many years total? 5 years total, so their hearts are in the classroom for sure. And she's also interested in those intersections among English ed, critical literacy, and civic engagement, which she's going to talk about tonight too. She is a postdoctoral fellow at the UCLA Graduate School of Education, and she also is a coordinator for the UCLA Council of Youth Research, which is a youth participatory action research that gets students involved in questions in their community and sharing their voices with others about what they've learned. Both of these ladies are connected learning ambassadors in the National Writing Project. I could go on, but gosh, they have a talk to do, so I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming out, everybody. We really appreciate it. We hear that Fort Collins in the winter, this is what it's always like, and we just want to stay here. This is the best weather I've ever experienced in Colorado during this month. And we want to get right into it before talking more about ourselves and our work. Anyone that's familiar with the Writing Project knows that anytime a Writing Project event starts, it starts with a little bit of writing. So we encourage you that if you have Twitter, if you're familiar with Twitter, we encourage you to get on and use this hashtag, CSULit15. If you are not on Twitter, that's fine. You can pull out your phone, your pieces of paper, analog, digital, however you want to write. And we want to just start off with just a very few minutes of writing on this question that we're going to keep exploring throughout this hour today. And this is the question: what is your working definition of critical literacy? We know that you came here as part of the speaker series on contemporary literacies, so we know you care about literacy. And we also know through Ontario and Cindy that you've done a lot of work thinking about what it means to be a critical educator who cares about social justice. So we want to know your working definition right now of what critical literacy means to you. So just take about 2-3 minutes, and then we're going to share some of our responses. Take about 30 seconds to finish up your last thought. This is just the beginning of brainstorming. All right, I'm sorry to rush you. If you're still tweeting, you can finish your tweet. If you're writing, you can finish your last word or sentence. And we want to know the community that's in the room a little bit, so if you could turn to someone near you, perhaps someone you don't know, smile at the person that you see across from you, and just share for a few minutes about what you wrote down. What is your working definition? And get a chance to know somebody in the room that maybe you hadn't met before.
I feel like there's just actually.
You can start wrapping up your final thought. I know you want to keep talking to your new friend. All right, let's bring it on back together. We hope that these conversations will continue. This is just the beginning. Do we have a few volunteers that would be willing to kind of share some of the conversation that you just had with someone? What are some of the ideas you have around critical literacy? You could raise your hand, or popcorn style, you can call some out. Go ahead.
I think we had a good range. We were talking about the critical aspect of the literacy, and that it's the questioning the things that we're reading in the world around us, and then also then as far as like really, I have no idea what that means. The four answer at the same time. So I think that's the interesting aspect of it.
You captured the essence of our talk. We can leave now. You got it. There is no one answer. Anyone else? A conversation that was going on around. We heard about the critical part of critical literacy, of reading the world, questioning assumptions. What did people say about the literacy part of critical literacy? What are some of the things you're thinking?
I was thinking it was beyond just the words and text. It could be also using social media or being people literacy, just being able to look at those kind of skills in classes. That kind of can also be critically thought out.
Yeah, I love that. Exploding the traditional idea of literacy. Literacy is not just pen and paper. We have new forms of expression at our fingertips, and there's new possibilities now of expression through digital media, and that's part of critical literacy as well. We'd love to hear what everyone has to say, and we're hoping that you're tweeting, those of you that use Twitter or other ways of sharing, because we'd love to continue the conversation online. But we're going to tell you a little bit about this idea of where do some of these ideas about critical literacy come from, and then how have we, in our professional work and in our research, struggled with what it means to really enact critical literacy in the messy real world of classrooms, which do not just conform to these ideal expectations that you might see in the theory. So a lot of the people that you're mentioning, the ideas that you're bringing up, there is a theoretical basis for this. Many of you may have read the work of Dr. Ernest Morrell, who's an advisor to both of us, who really set out a lot of these ideas about critical literacy. He builds his work on Paulo Freire, who talks about reading the word and reading the world. Peter McLaren talks about the political nature of challenging the status quo. So you are standing on the shoulders of giants in terms of the ideas that you are coming up with, people have been writing about over the past several decades and even longer. But one person who's very special to both of us, and whose words kind of formed our title for today, is Maxine Green, who sadly we lost last year. She's an amazing thinker. If you have not read her book, Releasing the Imagination, you should go out and buy it right now. She's amazing, and she really thinks about this connection between stories and art and creativity and critical literacy. But she said, where freedom is concerned, it's taken to signify either liberation from domination or the provision of spaces where choices can be made. And the opening of such spaces depends on support and connectiveness. And we were really taken by that phrase, spaces where choices can be made. because that implies purpose and it implies agency, and it is not a hard and fast definition. Choice is all about exploding that idea of one idea of what critical literacy can mean. And we wanted that to be the focus of our talk for today, because sadly, although I wish we could tell you that we have the answer of how to make this work in the classroom, throughout our professional lives and continually, we have more questions than we have answers. But we think if you ask the right questions and continue to ask yourself those right questions throughout your careers and with your students, you can come to some really amazing realizations about living critical literacy in your classrooms. So Danielle's going to talk a little bit about what that means and what the questions are we're going to talk to you about today that we hope you can bring into your practice.
So in thinking about this idea of critical literacy, we thought about it as this interrelated ecosystem, right? Something that's never stagnant and always changing. That's comprised of many components, right? You have your pedagogy that you revisit. Many of you are becoming teachers, right? And this word gets brought up often, right? Pedagogy. What are your beliefs about education? What are your beliefs about knowledge, right? And something often discussed initially, but and something that I'm going to be specifically talking about later on in my talk, is kind of the values and the ethics that undergird the pedagogy, right? What are those ethical considerations that you might take up inside of your classroom with students that come out of that pedagogy? What does that actually look like? The tools that you use. You mentioned digital media tools. It might be a variety of text. It might be each other. The context, often overlooked, right? Each of us are operating within different contexts, right? That are always changing. And perhaps most importantly, the people. And so we designed this very purposefully, kind of snazzy, I will have to say, right? And we thought about this as an ecosystem, and all of these overlap, right? They all inform one another. And at any given point, you might hear us talk about one particular component, but please don't assume that they don't feed into other components, right? That they're all informing each other. You'll also notice the lines are open, right? Because all of these things are always changing. And so the three questions, you know, we really talked about how we were going to approach this talk, right? What do? You know, how do you talk about critical literacy in our collective experiences across a couple of decades, right, in 45 minutes? And so we thought about kind of the questions that we took into consideration over time. Some questions that we had as educators in different but also similar contexts. And so the three questions are, what are the purposes for teaching critical literacy? And Nicole's going to discuss that. That was her question. How might critical literacy support an ethic of agency? And I'm going to talk about that. And then we're going to come together and talk about the third question, which is what forms of critical literacy production highlight purpose and agency?
So I wanted to start us off with this question of purpose. Many of you are going into the classroom, and even those of us that have been teaching or have been in the field for years, I think it's very important to continually come back to that foundational question of why am I doing this? What is my ultimate goal for my students? That is not the goal of my lesson, not the goal of my unit, or even of my course. It is why am I a literacy educator? And I know that for me, when I became a teacher, I became an English teacher because I always had loved the subject of English throughout my entire schooling. It had been a way, books were always a way for me to understand myself and to understand the world around me. And I had a very romantic love of literature that I then wanted to share with other young people. But I don't think I had a lot of sense of what the goals of literacy were for my students, other than I love books and I want to share that with them. And I hope that they love them too. And I'm going to show them how amazing Shakespeare is, and it's going to change their views of life and love forever and ever. And that's great, but it wasn't until I got into a real classroom with real students in an urban area, many of whom felt like their voices did not matter, many of whom felt marginalized by structures beyond their control that were affecting their communities and themselves, that I started to realize over time that I'm here because of language and literacy for a different reason. That even though I would love it if my students would remember all the words to be or not to be, the speech that I made them recite in class, I would hope they would remember that 10 years later and remember its beauty. And it would be great if they remembered how to diagram a sentence and all the rules of grammar. That really what mattered to me in the end is that they'd be able to use the skills of literacy to advocate for themselves and advocate for their communities in a really complex and often unjust world. I wanted them to be able to see how language can be used as power to manipulate people, and how they could make sure that they would not be manipulated, that they could use language and show the pen is mightier than the sword and take social action. And that's a purpose that I came to over years, it came to over time. It's not something I necessarily knew when I first got into the classroom. So all of you that are entering the classroom for the first time, I want you to think a little bit about, what is my purpose? Why do I think literacy is the key thing that I need to impart to students? What do I hope they're gonna do with it in their life? And for me, there's this idea that purpose is something that imbues everything that we do as teachers. I think when I first became a social justice educator, I thought that means I'm gonna teach books that have really critical themes. It all came down to the texts for me as an English teacher. We love texts as English teachers, we love books. And so I thought if I teach really critical books that talk about social justice issues, that means that I'll be a social justice educator and I'll be a critical literacy educator. But really, your theory that you operate by, the purpose that you have, imbues everything that you do as a teacher. From the way you set up your classroom, to the routines that you have, to the ways you speak with your students, to the kinds of grading you do, the assessments you give, it can get a little overwhelming. Literally every decision you make in the classroom is a moment where you are enacting a certain idea of what literacy should mean. And that can be pretty scary, especially when you're new. I remember planning every night for the next day, just feeling like I couldn't get ahead of myself, I couldn't get through the grind. It's hard to remember that you need to always have purpose in the back of your mind. And if you don't, and you think, well, I don't have a purpose, I'm just here to transmit content, that is actually a purpose being imposed upon you by these mainstream discourses in education that say college and career readiness, testing is the way. So if you don't take a stance is being imposed upon you, and you're giving students an idea that that's what education should be, and that's what literacy should be. So at least if we can take a conscious step back and say, what do I want my purpose to be? And how can I imbue that through everything that I do? Then you're not getting taken by these discourses that you might not agree with out there in the educational world. You get to make the conscious choice and help your students make conscious choices, which I think in the end, we're educating future adults and human beings in this world. That's really important. So what I want to talk to you about today is that's a little bit of how I came to my purpose, and that's something I'm constantly revisiting. But I also did this in my research with other teachers. So I did, for my dissertation work, I looked at the practice of several teachers who were really striving to become powerful critical literacy educators. And I wanted to know, well, how did they see their purpose of critical literacy? And then what did they do with it in the classroom to start making it real in all these areas? And the key here is that there's not one answer, because it all depends on who you are as a person, who your students are individually in front of you, and the context you're teaching in. So there's not one way to be a critical literacy educator. It all depends on who you are and what you bring to the classroom. So one teacher I worked with, these are all teachers working in South and East Los Angeles, in struggling schools with student populations who often felt like they didn't have a voice. And Ms. Nieto is one teacher I'm going to tell you about, who identifies as Chicana, has been teaching in South LA for 6 years. And I asked her, what do you think? Why do you teach literacy? What is your purpose in teaching literacy? And what she told me was, on the first day of school, I was like, you know what? I'm not here to just teach. Screw that. What matters is you're going to use this. You're going to fight for your people, and you're going to use this to change what's going on in your communities. So she had a very clear stance that she gave to me, a very strong stance. She identified racially and culturally with her students, many of whom were African American and Latino. And she identified as an activist, and that's how she saw critical literacy. So her idea was, I need to help my students understand the social forces that are acting on them, systemic racism, classism, and I need them to understand those forces so that we can all rise up in solidarity to create social movements for change. So she had a very political view to it. So I think of that, there's this expression in multicultural education that literacy can be a mirror. So she saw literacy as a mirror to help us understand ourselves better. So she wanted her students to read authors by books that look like them, that had similar experiences to them, so they can better understand themselves and analyze the world around them from their point of view. So it did influence the text that she chose, such as this book, Our America, which I recommend. It was actually written with the help of an NPR reporter. It was written by 2 young African-American boys in the 1990s living in the Chicago housing projects. And it's their exploration of why a crime had been committed in their community. It was their search to understand issues of juvenile justice and violence. Same issues that many of the students she was teaching were dealing with. And she would always tell her students, you are warrior scholars. This is a matter of life and death. So that's why I always think of Ms. Nieto as the warrior scholar. And she would say that to students in the classroom. If you're not handling your business, you're not being a warrior scholar. So that was a very clear perspective of critical literacy, but it's not the only one. Another teacher that I worked with is named Miss Brown. She worked in an East Los Angeles school. She had many more English learners than Ms. Nieto did. It was an entirely Latino population. And she saw her purpose as being a critical literacy educator in a different way. When I asked her about what literacy meant to her and the purpose for teaching it, she said there's basic communication, the ability to present yourself in general, to present yourself as an English speaker, and then the whole realm of academic language development. And then it's about accessing and changing the culture of power. So Ms. Brown was coming at this in a little bit of a different perspective. She wasn't as overtly political, but she said, I need to help my students gain language skills so that they can connect to people that are not like them and access a culture of power and speak a language that can help them get things done within the structure as it is today. How do you speak like a politician or like an educator in order to get into those social circles? So instead of talking about literacy as a mirror to understand themselves, she saw literacy as a window to see onto the experiences of other people who aren't like you, who don't share your same experiences. Now, I don't want to essentialize them. They were much more complex than this. They had ways that they would switch over back and forth. But this is just pulling out some themes that I saw of that there's not one way to be a critical literacy educator. And one text that she chose to explore with her students is the memoir Night. She wanted her students to connect their own experiences that they might have had with oppression to the experiences of Jewish folks during the Holocaust, so that they can see through the eyes of another and really develop empathy, which is another part of critical literacy, the idea that if we can't truly understand each other or try to get into each other's shoes and feel what other people feel, then it's going to be really difficult to have a more democratic society where we care more about each other. So very quickly, because I want to get to the next question, we can't talk about the whole study right now, the ways that this worked out. So what did this mean in their classrooms? Ms. Nieto would have conversations with her students, the warrior scholars, and they had conversations about juvenile justice because the characters in the book were talking about having life in prison sentences for juveniles. Is it okay to put a juvenile in prison for life for a crime they commit when they're young? And I highlighted a few things in red from this conversation because it's showing that young people, everybody has discussions in literacy classes. Discussion is a key part of ELA instruction. But because Ms. Nieto had a purpose and a stance, she tried to change from being just basically about texts to about civic issues and to their own lives. So Oscar Grant, I'm not sure if anyone has heard the news here, this happened a few years ago in California. A young African-American man on New Year's Eve was on the train station in San Francisco and was killed by a BART police officer with his back turned. So it was an issue that was really prevalent for students that they were thinking about when they thought about justice. Other students were bringing up their own personal experiences to say why they would act in a similar way to the characters in the books, or would they act differently. And then they were also bringing up their relationship to the state and relationship to people of authority in the state. So it turned a conversation about a text into a conversation about themselves, their communities, and civic life. And that was one way she was trying to make critical literacy real in her classroom. And instead of turning to a 5-paragraph essay after learning about juvenile justice and reading this text, she decided to do an authentic assessment. Students still had to write in paragraphs. They still had to use their Common Core skills of harnessing evidence, making an argument, making a claim. But instead of doing it for the teacher in the artificial environment of the classroom, she had them actually write letters to the governor of California about how they felt about juvenile justice. And so I highlighted them some things. So the students were able to speak their minds, develop their civic identities, take a stand. But also you could tell that Ms. Nieto had introduced them to other texts as well. So this student was able to learn that it costs $234,000 per year to incarcerate a young person. So she had to not only take what she learned from a fictional text, but use informational texts as well to make an argument and bring it all together, which was a Common Core perfect thing to do. But it has that critical literacy through line. On the other hand, Ms. Brown, so think about creating a window to an experience that's not like yours. I'll never forget this when I went to observe this classroom. When I say fishbowl simulation, I don't mean a fishbowl discussion, like we know when you have a small group discussion. She actually brought a fishbowl into the classroom with a live fish in it at the beginning of this unit about night. And she had arranged this with a student ahead of time who knew what she was about to do, but no one else in the room knew. And she walked into the class silently. She got a scooper and scooped the fish out of the tank and put it on the ground outside of water. Would have died within minutes. The class was horrified. Everybody was silent and staring, except for the one student who knew what was happening and knew that it was his cue to get up and put the fish back into the tank. And immediately after that experience, before anyone had a chance to even react, Ms. Brown asked the students, "What were you thinking?" And students were horrified, hating her, wondering why, like, how could you do this? And a student was finally able to realize, oh, I get what you're doing. This is a simulation because you want us to see how people stood by as Jewish people were persecuted and killed during the Holocaust. And it was a way to experience viscerally the emotion and connect to the experience of people they did not know and never knew and are not like them. And it was a really powerful way to start that unit. And very quickly, students also read canonical poetry. She wanted them to connect to canonical poets who maybe felt very distant from their own experience, and then mimic a poem, but writing their own experience, code switching between English and Spanish to explore how they felt about oppression, using this form of poetry as whoever their favorite poet was, they could mimic their style. And this is a student who, I won't read the whole thing for you, but you get the idea that the student is dealing with a lot of her personal feelings about her parents having to work low-wage jobs for long hours, and what that felt like to her. She was connecting that to the experience of people suffering during the Holocaust, which is really powerful. So it's just some ways that I saw in my practice and in other people's practice, the way that having a purpose could then start to inform how you teach your class, what you teach, and what kinds of activities you do. So we're going to keep coming back to this idea of purpose, but now we're going to move on to the second question that Danielle's going to talk about how this relates to agency.
All right, so hello everyone. So Nicole talked a lot about this idea of purpose, right? And constantly revisiting that. And the question that came to me when I was thinking about what I would talk about in this talk was this idea of fostering agency, right? For me, when I think about critical literacy, I constantly return back to this notion of agency. And just as a reminder, this kind of falls under the category of values and ethics, right? So what is it exactly that you're attempting to foster? Is it empathy? Is it love? Is it egalitarianism? What is it that you're attempting to foster, and are you specifically articulating that to students, right? So we have these purposes, right, for teaching that we oftentimes keep close to ourselves, right, without sharing that with students and naming exactly what it is we're there for, right? And so we oftentimes step into these environments that feel very isolated, right, and divorced from purpose, the opposite of what we're attempting to think about. And so what is agency, right? It's kind of a loaded word. And I think about it as the capacity of a living being to act in a world, right? It's the capacity to be able to make choices, right? To go back to our initial quote in the beginning from Maxine Greene. And a little bit about kind of why agency I discovered was so important for me as an educator and now as a teacher educator. I was brought to this largely through painful experiences, right? And reflecting back on my own experiences as a student who attended Detroit Public Schools through 8th grade, and then moving 7 minutes and 5 miles away to the suburbs and attending a suburban high school and seeing the gross inequity between the two spaces and the ways that literacy was taken up inside of these spaces, and realizing in both, but mostly in the urban context, the ways that literacy was treated was largely as a sorting mechanism. From those who were intelligent, separating those who were intelligent from those who were seen as not, right? And that was very far, and then later, becoming a teacher in Detroit Public Schools 20 years later and seeing it happen all over again, only this time I'm a teacher, right? I'm not a student. And just experiencing that and thinking about kind of what was going on. And it was this notion of agency. I did not feel as though the ways that literacy was being taken up were beneficial to me, my life, and where I was trying to go. And so this is substantiated by a lot of researchers, right? But Jean Anion did this study in the year that I was born. I'm not going to tell you, that's just a trivia question, right? And just to touch on this very quickly, right? She interviewed students across multiple contexts, right? From working class schools, middle class schools, and affluent professional schools, and asked them questions about knowledge, their understandings of knowledge, right? And so if you look at this last question, could you make knowledge, and if so, how, right? You look at these students here from the working class schools, and not 15 of them said no. One person said yes. And a quote from one of the students is, no, because the Board of Ed makes knowledge. Who makes knowledge? The Board of Ed, right? Middle class students kind of, split. Their answer was, I'd look it up, I'd go to the library. You can make knowledge listening and doing what you're told, right? So somewhat of a shift. And then you go to these affluent professional schools, and when asked the question, can you make knowledge, and so how, these students answer, yes, you can make knowledge if you invent something. I think of something to discover, then I'd make it. You can go explore for new things. And so the difference between these students and these students over here is largely a matter of them feeling as though they have agency. They are knowledge producers, right? And so as a teacher, I thought about how can I position students to feel as though they have agency, because it makes a world of a difference as it relates to how you operate in the world outside of you. And so I thought about a metaphor for agency. Well, what captures this idea? Because agency is not something, and I learned this the first few years of teaching, much like Nicole, agency is not something that you pass on to students. I cannot give them agency. I had to assume that they already had it, and they just needed spaces where they were committed to cultivate it, right? And so I thought about, nonetheless, working inside of Detroit schools for 10 years, that this was not easy at all. Many of you know this, right? And I want to demystify this, and I want to share with you kind of the strategic moves that I attempted to make. But this idea of forging came to mind because forging is a process by which elements are brought together under extreme heat or pressure or both, and they become strengthened, and what is then generated is much stronger than the elements were in their initial state, right? So an example is steel. And I thought about this, right? We are in these circumstances of like hyper-standardization, right? We oftentimes find ourselves in some really dehumanizing circumstances, as do our students, right? But what is the difference between producing steel and producing something that bends to it and feels absolutely defeated, whether that be us as teachers or students in their experience with schooling? And for me, it was about those intentional moves, again, to foster a sense of agency through these really trying circumstances. And so I named these, again, I hate to like categorize, what it is that I did, but it makes it a lot more accessible. And I'm going to share with you kind of these everyday practices that reflected these strategies. I call them the 3 C's, right? Critical listening, collaboration, and consciousness. And so critical listening. Originally, I put cultivating voice. But I thought to myself, you can walk into a classroom and have a sense of purpose, as Nicole shared earlier. You have an identified purpose. This is why you're teaching, right? But then you're replicating the same hierarchy of knowledge that you're attempting to resist, right? And that is teacher as expert. I have my purpose. I know what it is I need to do. I know what good readers look like. I know the activities that I have to design, right, to get them there, without ever listening, right? And perhaps one of the most revolutionary moves that we can make is to listen to one another, And that also means us as teachers, right? What does it mean to take a writing prompt or an activity and design it so that I am forced to listen to my students, where they're coming from, and also to allow them to engage in the act of listening to each other. And so a couple of examples of this, and yes, many English teachers would look at this and say, you know what, look at the misspelling. Like, I don't see that from this ESL student. She was asked for homework, all of the students were asked, what does your neighborhood tell you, right? And so she found a homeless person. She actually had a conversation with a homeless person in her neighborhood and said, and talked about the project, right, that she was assigned. And she didn't share with me how they initiated this conversation, but she said, you know, what's some advice you would give to me? And so she asked him to like write it on this, you know, this cardboard. And he said, don't quit school, right? And he holds it for a pose, and she takes a picture, and she brings this in the next day. And what a powerful conversation, right? I can say all day, like, don't quit school, and try your best, right? This image says enough, right? And so I ask students oftentimes to read their neighborhoods and for us to engage in this collective act of listening to those stories, right? Do nows. How many of you are asked to do nows in the beginning of your class period? I don't know which might hold them out here. Yeah, my principal was like, where's the do now on the board, first 5 minutes when they walk in, right? And so I asked my students to do, to draw or illustrate in whichever way they wanted to, what's your relationship with school? I wanted to know as an instructor, because that's important, what these students' relationship was with school, because I can't instruct them if I don't understand that, right? And so you can see, again, an amazing answer. If you can see this, you see it's a school incorporated, right? And the school is essentially ripping the student's arm off, right? And replacing the head is a book that's titled Rules, right? Complex understanding, right? And this is a student, again, this is in a context where students, I was told the students were operating at 5th grade reading level, right? But what kinds of reading are we privileging? What kinds of literacy are we privileging? Because these students clearly have very nuanced understandings of what's around them. They are reading. And last, I'm gonna share with you, those are individual activities. I also realized that we had to engage in these group activities around critical listening. So here's an example of a walking museum, you know, asking them, you know, to talk to each other in groups and answer these questions, bless you. Who has power in your neighborhood? What literacy practices exist in your neighborhood? What are the symbols and images that represent your community? Where does healing happen in your community? So here we are, sharing about what it is that we see. They're allowed to communicate their answers in multiple modes, right? And my students who are like graffiti artists, my students who live between a liquor store and a Coney Island, right? They felt like they were seen, right? All of a sudden, those students who are kind of putting their heads down, all of a sudden feel seen. Not just by me, but by everyone in the class. So it becomes this larger project that we're taking up together. And so the second C is collaboration. And I think that as it relates to agency, I need to find ways to mediate collaborative experiences, because there's this very like radically individualistic notion of success, right? We test the heck out of students. We say that if they perform well in particular tasks, that they're smart, right? And we know that when we enter the real world, that the real world is collaborative, right? And so and it's very difficult for students to understand systems of oppression if they're not engaged with other people outside of themselves, right? And so a couple examples of this are On the right-hand side, you'll see there was a group of LGBTQ youth, all men of color, who were bullied. And they ran away. There was a homeless shelter in the city of Detroit where they could live. And they did this youth participatory action research project where they went around and they interviewed other LGBTQ youth about their experiences in being bullied. And they had developed this entire presentation around this media project and around this research. And then I was asked if we could come in and present to my students. They had never presented. You can understand how sensitive that information is, right? They came in, they shared with students. You see them preparing. There's a digital media artist who was here helping facilitate the conversation. There's a hip hop artist, you can't see her, she's all the way on the right, who had come in and helped actually make the connection between myself and these young men. And collaboration was not just important to prepare students for the real world, but it was important for me because I knew that I couldn't do all of this by myself. I needed to invite people into my classroom to help students be able to engage in these activities. So inviting people in. On the left-hand side, we did this digital exchange with students in South Korea. And we did these group poems. Students were assigned to write about their neighborhoods. And so they wrote about their neighborhoods. They storyboarded these poems. They shot movies. And then they shared their movies with students in South Korea. So students in South Korea were learning about how students felt in Detroit, about their neighborhoods. And then this picture, they couldn't do the same exact project because they didn't have the same technology, but they did have mobile technology. And so they were asked to snap a picture of something that represented their day, a student from South Korea. And so you can see this buffet of food, right? Then they were asked to alter the image to reflect a wish that they had. And so these students, clearly you can see this figure handing out money, and there are you don't see it in the picture, there are family members sitting around the table, and here is their vision. They wish that they had access to more money. And so it's really powerful to participate in this collaborative exchange overseas, right? Using media. And here's another, here's another example. So the third C is critical consciousness. And so this idea of critical consciousness and being aware of larger systems that are in place and where you sit within those systems and feeling as though you have agency to be able to transform them, right, is largely dependent upon your exposure to systems and feeling as though you have a stake, right? So Paulo Freire in his literacy campaign in Brazil talks about this, right? Teaching ordinary people how to read using what he named as generative themes, right? Themes that connected to their lives, images, right? And so people learned how to read through these images that represented their everyday lives. And so taking that information and thinking about developing a critical consciousness whereupon you're learning how to read through becoming more aware of things that you care about in the world around you, I decided that a good place to foster this critical consciousness would be to develop essential questions that matter to students. And so one of the essential questions for my year, and many of you have these, right? What questions are going to guide your units, right? Was what's the relationship between language and power, and how does that manifest itself in my life? And so what I asked students to do, we brought in a green screen, and I asked them, how do you see yourself inside of that question, right? Yes, we applied that to Elie Wiesel's Night, and we read Catcher in the Rye, and we thought about this question as it related to the text, but we also thought about that question as it related to us, right? And it helps students to kind of unpack these larger systems at play, and it also allowed me to see how they saw themselves, right? And so you see this student, this is her image, and then students have to write and explain where they're coming from with almost everything. And she says, my image represents my belief that people should not let adverse statements influence education in our community. In my image, I'm standing in between a few of the common statements that are said about our school district. I'm covering my ears with my hands to indicate my resistance against the accepted assumptions that are made about our school district. We should not let others' opinions discourage us from pursuing a better future. Our community will benefit if we work against the standards that have been set up for our education. So what a powerful activity, right? The student was reflecting upon her experience in the education system. And let me tell you, when she shared her image, there was a really powerful moment with students in the class as they began to unpack this with her. So, again, just to return back to this idea of agency, right? I talked about kind of three things that I thought about in fostering it. Here's a quote from a student who was involved in a lot of media projects in my English course, 11th grade English course. And he says, this program brought me to school some days. And there were days that I wasn't gonna come and I thought, I gotta do my group media project. And I didn't do it for a grade. I did it because I categorized it as important. And so just to end, think about this concept of agency. What are you fostering inside of your classroom, inside of your respective English classrooms that makes students feel as though they're working towards something that's important? It might be very different from what you feel is important. But participating in that act of critical listening will allow you to come to terms with that and to really address the needs of students inside of your classrooms. And so moving on, the third question, Nicole's going to start us off. The third and final question that we thought of together was, what forms of critical literacy production highlight purpose and agency?
And actually, I think we're going to open it up. I know that we're running a little short on time, and Cindy and Antero want to make sure we have time to have dialogue with you. So all I'm going to say about this question, you've already seen examples of both of production from our first two questions. If you have purpose and you want to encourage student agency, what are things you can do in the classroom? One thing that brought us together as friends was this idea of doing youth participatory action research, which means that young people get to create their own questions about what they feel is important and then go out and do those things and use literacy skills that are Common Core based. You notice we haven't really said Common Core through this whole thing, but we can show you, and we're going to be sharing resources from the National Writing Project that we've created that show how you can actually do this in a classroom and show your administrator that it is Common Core oriented and that you can do it while teaching American literature or British literature. Because we would tie units about consumerism and citizenship to The Great Gatsby to to research questions that students were doing in their own lives about consumerism. So there are ways to bring all tiles together. The Council of Youth Research at UCLA is something that I've worked on, coordinating for the past 6 years. You can look it up and see a lot of the multimedia productions that students have made that incorporate literacy skills that are critical and academic at the same time. And we're not going to play this video yet, but Danielle does the same work in Detroit in the classroom in ways that you can show to any administrator and they would see. So if we have time, we'll share more afterwards for anyone that wants to stick around. But for right now, we just want to stop and encourage you to keep thinking about these three questions in your own practice, because that's what animates us and keeps us going. That we don't have all the answers, but as long as we keep asking these questions, we're on the right track toward thinking about critical literacy. So thank you very much. Contact us and let's talk for a few minutes before we have to leave. So thank you very much.
We have a few minutes for Q&A, so I'm gonna let Nicole and Danielle handle that because they're teaching bosses. They can do that. So if you have questions, raise your hand.
All at once, come on.
Yeah.
I haven't really had time to actually formulate this, but I'm more, so I teach composition here, and I'm more often in a classroom with students who are less aware of like the non-dominant cultures and forces around them. They're pretty just unexposed to people without a certain amount of privilege and power, and so just sort of like to. I'm thinking about how I can plot what you've done on its head and sort of teach it in the other direction. If you have any thoughts or that wasn't really a question.
No, yeah, I know what you're saying. So if you're talking to students who maybe need to unpack some privilege or unpack some of these issues that aren't experiencing it themselves, what does it mean to have that kind of dialogue across difference, especially in the society we live in where it's getting more and more polarized, and it's difficult for people to even kind of reach across boundaries of politics or race or class to have these difficult conversations. I was thinking about this recently with the Ferguson decision, and some people on my Facebook wall saying things that I was not prepared for, and thinking, how do I have this conversation, or do I just friend them? You know, the easy thing is to just retreat into the people you're comfortable with,
Right.
and to get rid of that. But if we really care about civic dialogue in a country that's going to continue to have tough issues, how do we have that conversation? So I think doing this process of research and inquiry is, I think, a really powerful way with any student, because it forces you to ask more questions and that you need to actually go out and collect data from people other than yourself to answer those questions. So I think going through the inquiry process of making a question, developing interview questions, developing a survey protocol maybe, doing research where you actually go to places to gather data, and you have to assume the answer does not lie within yourself, it lies out in the community, can help students even who maybe aren't experiencing hardship on a daily basis to go out and maybe see a different perspective and present data and findings from people who are not like them. I think it could be a really powerful way to get in without being too threatening. And then the classroom space is the place to really try to have those difficult conversations of unpacking our own personal experiences and what it means to be a teacher.
And I think it's also very important that sometimes we have limited memory, or we have selective memory. I think sometimes as a country that we're oftentimes scared to really place things within a historical context. And so I think it's really powerful for all people to understand kind of where why these issues are surfacing, right? That it's not just this personal bias or one experience, right? But to understand across history, you know, what has happened and led to particular issues that are being taken up right now, right? And so maybe even encouraging students to like look at their social media, you know, look at their Twitter feeds, identify something that either bothers them or interests them, and encouraging them, you know, to investigate that issue and then possibly to interview someone who feels differently about that issue than them, and then encouraging them to also research, you know, the historical context of that issue. I know something in a class that I just took with Dr. Yolanda Silva Ruiz at Teachers College, had us all read, and you can imagine, like, kind of a privileged place, right? Columbia University. Many students were resistant to, you know, very similar to kind of your tensions. We read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and I encourage, you know, you to perhaps take up that text and maybe take a couple pieces of it and share with students and ask them, you know, what do you think about this? And start from there. Yeah.
Can I ask the devil's advocate question of this all looks great, and as a teacher who's dealing with Common Core and Park here, or Smarter Balance, depending on what state you're in, and a billion tests and all the other stuff that's going on, how do you balance this with the kinds of things that make sure you keep your job from year to year in the classroom?
I'd say number one, there is a lot more support for this in the standards than you might think. The standards themselves are not critical, but how you use standards can be done in a critical way. There are standards that are calling for young people to use the internet to produce and publish writing, so there's no reason that you can't use that as a way to get them into Twitter or blogging or using Facebook to give political messages. So you already have justification for that right there. Students have to produce media in different formats. So they can be producing PowerPoints, they can be producing videos. Everything that we showed here is all standards-based. And we will share more of our lesson plans online. Because after I was done my time at UCLA, got my PhD, I went back to the classroom full-time to try to figure out how to put some of these ideas I had learned in this very privileged space of the university into work at a charter school that was constantly giving benchmark tests every 2 weeks, in addition to getting ready for the state tests. We've reworded test questions to actually be about some of the concepts that were critical that we were discussing in class, so that they were understanding the structure of a test question, but they were doing it with content that was more critical. So they were learning how to play that game while also struggling against it and being able to express their own opinions. So there are creative ways. It does take more work than simply going with the flow and saying, well, this is what I have to do. I'm a teacher, I'm a pawn in the system. I'm just gonna do the testing they tell me to do. It takes more work to fight against it, but in the end, you're staying true to your purpose and helping students have more agency.
And I would say also that it's less about the product and it's more about the process. So we're not even asking you to create anything different at the end, right? We're just asking you to think about the process that you use to get students there, because oftentimes that process is more reflective of our privileged conceptions of knowledge, right? We're all here, we've made it, right? And so oftentimes when we come up against issues or struggles, we draw from our own toolbox, right? This is how I was taught, therefore this is how I'm going to take this on. And so oftentimes we're at a loss. And so what we're asking you to do is to just rethink your process for getting students there. Yeah. The boss is cutting us off.
I was just gonna invite you to thank Nicole and Danielle for ideas. You should follow the Twitter feed. If you haven't, look at the hashtag. Some really great things got tweeted out during this. Join us for cupcakes and brownies and water if you want to. Just take something on the road. If you want to do that. And then on February 17th was the one more shout out. Dr. Kirshner, Dan Kirshner is going to be here talking about his work that's similar in nature, I think, to the work that you guys have done with civic literacy and street literacy. Thank you for coming. Thank you.